Chapter 26. A Job for Mr. Dovedale. Daisy had gone to school, and Mr. Dovedale was busy in his workshop the next morning when Major Roach knocked on the carpenter's door. Mr. Dovedale knew Roach as the man who lived in his old house, and who'd replaced Major Beamish as the head of the Royal Guard. The carpenter invited Roach inside, but the Major declined. "We've got an urgent job for you at the palace, Dovedale," he said. "A shaft on the King's carriage has broken, and he needs it tomorrow." "Already?" said Mr. Dovedale. "I only mended that last month." "It was kicked," said Major Roach, "by one of the carriage horses. Will you come?" "Of course," said Mr. Dovedale, who was hardly likely to turn down a job from the King. So he locked up his workshop and followed Roach through the sunlit streets of the city within the city, talking of this and that until they reached the part of the royal stables where the carriages were kept. Half a dozen soldiers were loitering outside the door, and they all looked up when they saw Mr. Dovedale and Major Roach approaching. One soldier had an empty flour sack in his hands, and another a length of rope. "Good morning," said Mr. Dovedale. He made to walk past them, but before he knew what was happening, one soldier had thrown the flour sack over Mr. Dovedale's head, and two more had pinned his arms behind his back and tied his wrists together with the rope. Mr. Dovedale was a strong man. He struggled and fought, but Roach muttered in his ear, "Make one sound and it'll be your daughter who pays the price." Mr. Dovedale closed his mouth. He permitted the soldiers to march him inside the palace, though he couldn't see where he was going. He soon guessed, though, because they took him down 2 steep flights of stairs and then onto a third, which was made of slippery stone. When he felt a chill on his flesh, he suspected he was in the dungeon, and he knew it for sure when he heard the turning of an iron key and the clanking of bars. The soldiers threw Mr. Dovedale onto the cold stone floor, and somebody pulled off his hood. The surroundings were almost completely dark, and at first Mr. Dovedale couldn't make anything out around him. Then one of the soldiers lit a torch, and Mr. Dovedale found himself staring at a pair of highly polished boots. He looked up. Standing over him was a smiling Lord Spittleworth. "Good morning, Dovedale," said Spittleworth. "I've a little job for you. If you do it well, you'll be home with your daughter before you know it. Refuse, or do a poor job, and you'll never see her again. Do we understand?" 6 soldiers and Major Roach were lined up against the cell wall, all of them holding swords. "Yes, my lord," said Mr. Dovedale in a low voice. "I understand." "Excellent," said Spittleworth. Moving aside, he revealed an enormous piece of wood, a section of a fallen tree as big as a pony. Beside the wood was a small table, bearing a set of carpenter's tools. "I want you to carve me a gigantic foot, Dovedale, a monstrous foot, with razor-sharp claws. On top of that foot I want a long handle so that a man on horseback can press the foot into soft ground to make an imprint. Do you understand your task, carpenter?" Mr. Dovedale and Lord Spittleworth looked deep into each other's eyes. Of course, Mr. Dovedale understood exactly what was going on. He was being told to fake proof of the Ickabog's existence. What terrified Mr. Dovedale was that he couldn't imagine why Spittleworth would ever let him go after he'd created the fake monster's foot, in case he talked about what he'd done. "Do you swear, my lord," said Mr. Dovedale quietly, "do you swear that if I do this my daughter won't be harmed and I'll be permitted to go home to her?" "Of course, Dovedale," said Spittleworth lightly, already moving to the door of the cell. "The quicker you complete the task, the sooner you will see your daughter again. Now, every night we'll collect these tools from you, and every morning they'll be brought back to you, because we can't have prisoners keeping the means to dig themselves out, now can we? Good luck, Dovedale, and work hard. I look forward to seeing my foot." And with that, Roach cut the rope binding Mr. Dovedale's wrists and rammed the torch he was carrying into a bracket on the wall. Then Spittleworth, Roach, and the other soldiers left the cell. The iron door closed with a clang, a key turned in the lock, and Mr. Dovedale was left alone with the enormous piece of wood, his chisels, and his knives. Chapter 27. Kidnapped. When Daisy arrived home from school that afternoon, playing with her bandolier as she went, she headed as usual to her father's workshop to tell him about her day. However, to her surprise, she found the workshop locked up. Assuming Mr. Dovedale had finished work early and was back in the cottage, she walked in through the front door with her school books under her arm. Daisy stopped dead in the doorway, staring around. All the furniture was gone, as were the pictures on the walls, the rug on the floor, the lamps, and even the stove. She opened her mouth to call her father, but in that instant a sack was thrown over her head and a hand clamped over her mouth. Her schoolbooks and bandolier fell with a series of thuds to the floor. Daisy was lifted off her feet, struggling wildly, and then carried out of the house and slung into the back of a wagon. "If you make a noise," said a rough voice in her ear, "we'll kill your father." Daisy, who had drawn breath into her lungs to scream, let it out quietly instead. She felt the wagon lurch and heard the jingling of a harness and trotting hooves as they began to move. By the turn that the wagon took, Daisy knew they were heading out of the city within the city, and by the sounds of market traders and other horses, she realised they were moving into wider Shoeville. Though more frightened than she'd ever been in her life, Daisy nevertheless forced herself to concentrate on every turn, every sound, and every smell, so she could get some idea of where she was being taken. After a while, the horses' hooves were no longer falling on cobblestones, but on an earthy track, and the sugar-sweet air of Shoeville was gone, replaced by the green, loamy smell of the countryside. The man who'd kidnapped Daisy was a large, rough member of the Ickabog Defence Brigade called Private Prod. Spittleworth had told Prod to get rid of the little dovetail girl, and Prod had understood Spittleworth to mean that this was to kill her. Prod was quite right to think this. Spittleworth had selected Prod for the job of murdering Daisy because Prod was fond of using his fists and seemed not to care who he hurt. However, as he drove through the countryside, passing woods and forests where he might easily strangle Daisy and bury her body, it slowly dawned on Private Prod that he wasn't going to be able to do it. He happened to have a nice niece around Daisy's age, of whom he was very fond. In fact, every time he imagined himself strangling Daisy, he seemed to see his niece Rosie in his mind's eye, pleading for her life. So instead of turning off the dirt track into the woods, Prod drove the wagon onwards, racking his brains as to what to do with Daisy. Inside the flour sack, Daisy smelled the sausages of Baronstown mingling with the cheese fumes of Kurdsburg, and wondered which of the two she was being taken to. Her father had occasionally taken her to buy cheese and meat in these famous cities. She believed that if she could somehow give the driver the slip when he lifted her down from the wagon, she'd be able to make her way back to Shoeville in a couple of days. Her frantic mind kept returning to her father and where he was, and why all the furniture in their house had been removed, but she forced herself to concentrate on the journey the wagon was making instead, to be sure of finding her way home again. However, hard as she listened out for the sound of the horses' hoofs on the stone bridge over the flumer that connected Baronstown and Kurdsburg, it never came, because instead of entering either city, Private Prod passed them by. He had just had a brainwave about what to do with Daisy. So, skirting the city of sausage makers, he drove on north. Slowly, the meat and cheese smells disappeared from the air, and night began to fall. Private Prod had remembered an old woman who lived on the outskirts of Jeroboam, which happened to be his hometown. Everyone called this old woman Ma Grunter. She took in orphans and was paid 1 ducat a month for each child she had living with her. No boy or girl had ever succeeded in running away from Ma Grunter's house, and it was this that made Prod decide to take Daisy there. The last thing he wanted was Daisy finding her way back home to Shoeville, because Spittleworth was likely to be furious that Prod hadn't done what he was told. Though so scared, cold and uncomfortable in the back of the wagon, the rocking had lulled Daisy to sleep, but suddenly she jerked awake again. She could smell something different in the air now, something she didn't much like, and after a while she identified it as wine fumes, which she recognised from the rare occasions when Mr. Dovetail had a drink. They must be approaching Jeroboam, a city she had never visited. Through the small holes in the sack she could see daybreak. The wagon was soon jolting over cobblestones again, and after a while it came to a halt. At once Daisy tried to wriggle out of the back of the wagon onto the ground, but before she'd hit the street, Private Prod seized her. He carried her struggling to the door of Ma Grunter's, which he pounded with a heavy fist. All right, I'm coming," came a high, cracked voice from inside the house. There came the noise of many bolts and chains being removed, and Ma Grunter was revealed in the doorway, leaning heavily on a silver-topped cane, though, of course, Daisy, still being in the sack, couldn't see her. "New child for you, Ma," said Prod, carrying the wriggling sack into Ma Grunter's hallway, which smelled of boiled cabbage and cheap wine. Now you might think Ma Grunter would be alarmed to see a child in a sack carried into her house, but in fact the kidnapped children of so-called traitors had found their way to her before. She didn't care what a child's story was. All she cared about was the 1 ducat a month the authorities paid her for keeping them. The more children she packed into her tumble-down hovel, the more wine she could afford, which was really all she cared about. So she held out her hand and croaked, 5 ducat placement fee, which was what she always asked for, if she could tell somebody really wanted to get rid of a child. Prod scowled, handed over 5 ducats, and left without another word. Ma Grunter slammed the door behind him. As he climbed back onto his wagon, Prod heard the rattle of Ma Grunter's chains and the scraping of her locks. Even if it had cost him half his month's pay, Prod was glad to have got rid of the problem of Daisy Dovetail, and he drove off as fast as he could back to the capital.